Hey all, Eric here with today's LGBT history moment. Today, you see, the reason I have my cap on is because I shaved like a couple of days ago, so I haven't been shaved my head and everything, and we don't have the heat on yet. It's about 61, maybe 62 degrees outside, but we have turned the heat on, so that's fine. Got one of my favorite sweaters on, and then just keep the heat inside my body. Um, got my little hat on, beanie on, 'cause I'm not spending money on skull caps. And I don't like the twin sisters anyway. But anyway, today we're spotlighting an organization in our history that is still around, but not as visible as they used to be, certainly, and the purpose of their creation. And I'm talking about ACT UP. ACT UP stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And anyone my age who was around at that time, at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, particularly when there was no name for the disease, and then when ACT UP came on the scene, there were satellite chapters of ACT UP all around the country. And at the time, I was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and while I was not a member of a local ACT UP chapter, I did participate in some of the civil disobedience areas with ACT UP. Um, Unfortunately, I was never really in the closet personally, but then there were some places that I was going, it would have been dangerous for me to be out. And so that was one reason why I did not join formally the ACT UP chapter at the time. And the guy I was dating at the time, he was not out at all. And so I had to think about our situation. But let's dive in. Let's dive in. And here's their logo. And we'll talk about ACT UP. And so, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, is an international grassroots political group working to end the AIDS pandemic. The group works to improve the lives of people with AIDS through direct action, medical research, treatment, and advocacy, and working to change legislation and public policies. ACT UP was formed on March 12, 1987, at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in New York City. Co founder Larry Kramer was asked to speak as part of a rotating speaker series, and his well attended speech focused on action to fight AIDS. Kramer spoke out against the state of the gay men's health crisis, known as the GMHC, which he perceived as politically impotent. Kramer had co founded the GMHC, but had resigned from its board of directors in 1983. According to Douglas Kemp, Kramer posed a question to the audience: do we want to start a new organization devoted to political action? The answer was a resounding yes. Approximately 300 people met 2 days later to form ACT UP. At the Second National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in October of 1987, ACT UP New York made their debut on the national stage as an active and visible presence in both the march, the main rally, and at the civil disobedience at the United States Supreme Court building in the following days. Inspired by this new approach to radical direct action, other participants in these events returned home to multiple cities and formed local ACT UP chapters in Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, the state of Rhode Island, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and other locations. ACT UP spread internationally. In many countries, separate movements arose based on the American model. For example, the famous gay rights activist Rosa von Praunheim co-founded ACT UP Germany. Much of the documentation chronicling ACT UP's history is drawn from Douglas Kemp's History of ACT UP, the ACT UP Oral History Project, and the online capsule history of ACT UP New York. Now, most of the things you can look up, ACT UP, and look up Douglas Crimp to find most of the things, but I'm just going to relate a small story about something that ACT UP did in Washington, D.C. in the 90s. And I will never forget this as long as I live. And I wasn't able to find a picture of it before this recording. But an ACT UP chapter went to D.C. And at the time, their biggest opponent was a senator from North Carolina named Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms became known as Senator No. And he was an anti-LGBTQ senator. I mean, most of the senators today have nothing on Jesse Helms. And were it not for ACT UP standing up to Jesse Helms and being the ire and bane of his existence, I think the LGBT community, from my perspective, would not have gone forward as much as it did. And so, I can't remember the circumstances, but overnight, and how they got it created, but overnight, the ACT UP chapter went to Jesse Helms' home in D.C. And they secretly overnight placed this over the house, over the entire house. And the next day, journalists and publications swarmed the home. And what they found was a giant condom placed over Jesse Helms' house. Yes, a giant condom. And I saw the picture. I rolled. And I was like, bravo, bravo, bravo. And so that was one of the things I remember about them doing. ACT UP still exists. I think mainly in some of the major cities like New York and Los Angeles. Smaller chapters than their numbers used to be because of the advances on HIV. But the main organization here in Charlotte is RAIN. And RAIN has a very visible presence. And I'm thankful that RAIN still exists because of the disparity, even today, in healthcare between the main population who live with HIV, which is the virus that causes AIDS, and the Black and brown communities, which have been devastated by this. Yes, great strides have been made, but there is still disparity. And so I thank RAIN for the work that they do in that respect. And in some parts, they've helped me get over some issues I had with not being positive. I mean, there were times when I thought that I may have gotten the virus, and I didn't. And honestly, it was just by divine grace that I didn't get it. And I've been on panels where we've talked about, I guess you could call me as someone who was around when people were dying. And I suffered from survivor's guilt for a bit. And organizations like RAIN here in Charlotte, and there was an organization out in Kansas City who actually asked me to speak on a couple of panels about my story and the fact that I lived and people that I knew died decades ago. And that was very healing for me, very healing for me. And one of the things that I thought that I had done, which I didn't do, was forgive myself. And I say all that to say that even in today's climate, with being under the attacks that we are under, there are still people who are sick and still people who are dying. Yes, their medication has made great strides. We have U equals U, where if you take your medication, you can become undetectable. But it's still a journey. It is still a journey. And there is still hope that a vaccine is on the horizon. And meanwhile, it's not just the United States that is dealing with this. There are other countries that are dealing with this. And this administration on day one actually cut funding for HIV medication going to other countries that were devastated. And fortunately, the court system held it up and that funding had to be reinstituted. And my point, that right there, my point that I always try to make towards the end of my videos, where I can wrap it up and say elections have consequences on the federal level, on the state level, on the county level, and on the city level. All elections have consequences. But please remember, if nothing else, October the 18th, more than 7 million people understood resistance is not futile. It's not. So you take care. I hope your Sunday was great, because we're in for some chilly, rainy weather in Charlotte. And this is the last week of daylight savings time. I should be wearing black because I'm mourning the end of summer. But take care, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace.